So by now you've heard of Ebola, right? That thing that's affected more than 5,000 people in Western Africa? And as of September 16th, it's killed more than half of the people it's affected. That's 50% of its victims have died. But we're over here in America, so why should we care? Well, for one thing, it's killed more than 50% of its victims. And if left untreated, that statistic goes up to about 90%. Alright, now we care, so let's treat it. Good news comes from an American company, MAP Bio Inc. They've come up with an experimental drug treatment called ZMapp that effectively saved the lives of 2 people infected already. See, Ebola is a virus, which means it enters the body externally and directly infects the host cell. ZMapp is made up of antibodies which grab hold of the virus and prevent it from entering the host cell. Sounds great, but wait, let's not get ahead of ourselves. ZMapp is an experimental drug, which means it needs to undergo randomized controlled clinical trials before it can receive FDA approval. This simply means that we get some guy, we balance his fluids and electrolytes, maintain his oxygen and blood pressure, treat him for any complicating infections, and boom, treat him with the drug. We do this on enough people and we get FDA approval and the company makes the drug available for everyone. At least, that's how it works here in America. But we have to solve the problem in Western Africa. Here in America, we have a government agency known as the NIH, and they're responsible for biomedical and health-related research. And in fact, they're pretty good at initiating medical research and development. Studies show that scientists who receive grants from the NIH are 20% more likely to publish papers within 5 years. This means that we the taxpayers fund the government agency known as the NIH, who funds biomedical research and development that runs clinical trials on patients before getting FDA approval and allowing full market availability of the drug. And this process is going to take about 8 years to complete. Hold up, this is sounding way more complicated than before. In 8 years, people are dying from Ebola right now. Can't we speed up the process? Well, there's an investigational new drug program, or IND, that can cut the time in half by reducing trial phases in times of disaster and allowing a drug to undergo FDA review in as little as 3 years. But this isn't the biggest obstacle we face in the fight against Ebola, because by now you're wondering, how are we going to pay for all of this? We've already established that a large amount of biomedical research and development in America is funded by taxpayer dollars, just over 30%. But sending researchers and equipment over to Western Africa is really expensive. How are we going to overcome the dollar sign? In some cases, scientists have been privately funded by companies such as IBM. Unfortunately, most companies are only likely to fund scientists if it is likely that they will receive money back. So in times of crisis, we then look to the United Nations and the World Health Organization, or WHO. The WHO is much more likely to fund medical research for the simple return of international peace and security. And the United States can be the leading nation in WHO's fight against Ebola, seeing as we provide 41% of the overall funding in fiscal year 2012. Actually, the United States has already proposed a Security Council resolution to the United Nations, calling for greater assistance, including medical personnel and field hospitals. But let's not pat ourselves in the back just yet. Now, the WHO has proven itself effective in Africa before. In 2006, the WHO provided vaccines to Namibia during a rampant polio outbreak. A total of 2 million people were vaccinated, reaching 95% of all citizens living in 30 of the 34 health districts. The bad news? The UN annually falls about $150 billion short of its goal to aid developing nations. And in the case of the polio outbreak, nearly 78% of the $32 million cost was assumed by the Namibian government. Oh, and it costs about $5 billion to create a new drug and make it available to the public. $5 billion? If you're thinking that there's no way the American taxpayers assume the $5 billion cost of creating each new drug, then you'd be right. Let's go back. About 30% of all biomedical research and development in America is funded by taxpayer dollars. Where does the rest of the money come from? The answer is the pharmaceutical companies. You know, the multi-billion-dollar companies that are responsible for telling us which drugs we can and cannot take, and more or less which diseases we can and cannot treat? Yeah, those companies. The popular drug Lipitor earns $11 billion annually, and yet pharmaceutical companies have no interest in research and development in developing countries because they are unlikely to provide a decent monetary return. And what percentage of people infected with Ebola are dying from it? More than half. But finding a cure for Ebola is expensive. Like, really expensive. And let's face it, the American pharmaceutical companies have the money. The main obstacle developing nations face in getting the necessary drugs is the 20-year patent that pharmaceutical companies earn for creating a drug. This makes it possible for companies to charge a ton of money for their drug. It's for this reason that most African nations didn't receive the necessary treatment for AIDS until around 2006, more than 10 years after those in America were able to receive treatment. As of right now, these patents are the only real incentive the companies have for creating new drugs, and it's hard to provide incentive. The best course of action at this point would be for the government to subsidize the pharmaceutical companies in order to get them to relinquish patents or to provide the drugs for a cheaper price. It may seem backwards to pay the multi-billion-dollar companies, but even providing one-time cash rewards can greatly increase incentive. They are also cost-effective and encourage future investment in public goods. In the long term, steady public funding of pharmaceutical companies would make the people the main stakeholders in medical research and development and would allow the market to correctly assess what endeavors receive how much money, thus correcting the problems that monopolies create. So what can you do right now? You can continue to urge our government to take a bigger stand during times of crisis. You can continue to elect public officials who are committed to the funding of sciences and other humanities, and you can continue to donate to privately funded organizations such as the MSF, or in America, Doctors Without Borders. Organizations like this have direct contact with the UN and are the leaders in funding projects in war-torn regions and developing countries facing disease.